This is Alabama Politics with Steve Flowers, an in-depth interview with Alabama's top political newsmakers. Now, from the studios of Troy University, here is Steve Flowers.
I'm Steve Flowers, and welcome to Alabama Politics. Folks, we're very fortunate tonight to have one of my favorites, Dr. Ed Bridges, who served 30 years as head of our archives and history. He's a legend, an icon. He knows more about Alabama history than anybody in the world. I'm telling you one thing, he is one treasure Alabama's proud of, and he's one of my favorite guests, and I know y'all seen him several times here on the show, but he's got a new book. He finally spent 3 years writing a book on Alabama history, which will be one of the most treasured things. I've been waiting for it for a long time. The book is called Alabama, The Making of an American State. And our friend Ed Bridges has finally put all this in writing, and we've got a great history book for us Alabamians who love Alabama history. Ed, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks for being on the show. Ed's been on a couple of times before, and he and I get off on just one segment of Alabama history, and we get carried away a little bit with it. And we spent a lot of times, one time on the Indians, just the Indians. But kind of give us an overview of the book. What years do you cover the entire era of Alabama history?
Yeah, from the time that the Stone Age, when the first Indians walked into Alabama, probably about 14,000 years ago, until the 2010 elections.
Ed, had anybody, this will be, in my opinion, the book on Alabama history. Has anybody tried to go back and do it like you've done in this thing? Did you have anybody prior to you that wrote? Well, Summersell wrote something on Alabama history.
There have been some history. There have been some big history books that are kind of academic. The most recent big one is the one that Wayne Flint, Leah Atkins, Bill Rogers, and Dave Ward did. That's about 800 pages, and it's kind of a comprehensive history.
Yeah.
But it's it's hard to read as a story because it's so big and so complex, and and it doesn't have pictures, as many pictures. Yeah. So my idea was, I spent my entire career at the archives working in between the general public who was coming in to learn about Alabama history and the academic historians who were coming in to research Alabama history, and I worked with both. And the idea here was to try to write a book like 250 pages with a lot of pictures that's an overview, it's an introduction to the big stories, the big flow of Alabama history, and that's what I've tried to do with this.
Do you foresee this book being used for fourth grade Alabama history?
No, I think it's more too complex. I think it would work with high schools.
Yeah.
I think not all high school students would find it interesting, but I think an interested high school student who cares about history could use it, or college students, or again, my audience when I was trying to write this was just an interested person on the street who might come into the museum of the archives and see it and say, I'd like to learn a little bit more about Alabama history, but I don't want to read an 800-page really academic book, and I'd like to have an introduction. And then if I'm particularly interested in a subject like Reconstruction or the Constitution of 1901, could go into more detail later, but I want to get an overview to start with.
You know, my interest, as you know, in forte is somewhat Alabama political history. But I love every aspect of Alabama history, and I really appreciate your knowledge and your ability, and I'm so glad you've got this book.
Well, thank you.
That we'll be able to use in future years. But Ed, one era, and I'm going to ask you this question, and I'll tell you mine. My favorite era in Alabama political history would be starting around the Depression, the 1920s through the 1960s, and our congressional delegation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story.
I'd even say going back as far as the Bankheads from the 1900s. Our congressmen had an inordinate amount of power because they had the seniority, they had the knowledge, they controlled the United States Senate and the House. starting with the Bankheads. And tell me before I go into my stuff, who were your favorite what era is your favorite political era? Who were your favorite political stories?
You know, it's almost everything, whatever I've done last, it's so interesting all the way through. There's not a part of Alabama. You know, one thing for us in Alabama, we tend to look down on Alabama history as kind of not quite up to the level of Greek or Roman history or European history, but many of the great themes in the history of America and many of the great themes even in the history of humanity are played out here in Alabama. Alabama history is a magnificent and interesting story, and everything you get into, every big subject you can find here in Alabama. You know, for instance, we were just talking about this before the show, like the Communist Party in Alabama in the 1930s. What an interesting story, and not many people know about that story. Or the story of Reconstruction and the details of how the different eras, the periods within the Reconstruction period, the different groups and factions that came together. That's just fascinating stuff. You and I were talking on the phone the other day about the Dead Shoes primary.
Yeah.
That's another one of those great stories.
Yeah.
You know, Alabama history is just filled with those stories.
It is. Talking about that Dead Shoes primary, you know, let's talk about the Bankheads a little bit, because the only person to serve in the archives like you did was Marie Bankhead, Owen. She was a 30-year veteran.
Yeah,
you know, so in history, if you're talking about history, you've got your mark in history. She was the first, probably she and her husband were the first archives directors, weren't they?
Yeah, that's right.
And go back and talk about the Bankheads
Actually,
a little bit.
For more than 30 years, I sat at her desk and in her chair.
Is that right? The Marie Owen Bankhead chair?
The same chair. I can feel it now.
Because you didn't want to, you wanted to sit in the history chair, didn't you?
Well, it was a beautiful chair. It was comfortable. You know, but it was history too. It really was.
Well, tell me, what year did you come to the archive?
1982.
That's the year I went to the legislature. Yeah. And I love the fact you've got that old House chamber. Is the first page. So much has happened in that old House chamber. The Alabama seat of the Union in that House chamber.
Yeah, that's right.
I served there as a page, and I was a little boy, and I had the opportunity to serve there as a House member and all these years.
You may not realize this, but every constitution in Alabama history, except for the 1819 Constitution, was written in that chamber.
In that chamber.
All 6.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
I used to walk up the back stairs, and I still do. If the governor's state of the state address, they'll let me walk up the back stairs. That's how I used to come in as a page back there. But I'm glad you had that on the front page. Let's go back to the Bankheads, though, because Alabama Public Television had a real good story on the Bankheads, and what a family.
Yeah, amazing.
You had John Hollis Bankhead, who was a United States Senator. His son, William B. Bankhead, became a congressman, and they served together in the House and Senate. That'll never happen again, probably. A father and son tandem, and his son became Speaker of the House, and sired Tallulah Bankhead, the most famous movie star of that era, and an actress. And then what a family! And then their sister Marie was head of the archives for 30 years. She got the money for the building from through the WPA program at that thing. Tell the history of that a little bit, how that happened. Talk about them and tell the history of how Miss Marie went to Washington and asked for that money. It was a private meeting, but the guy who's head of that program didn't know her brother was the Speaker of the House and her daddy was the United States Senator.
You know, it's almost a legend. It's hard to separate fact from fiction in this story because it's become one of those wonderful stories of Alabama history. But so Will Bankhead was the Speaker of the House. John Bankhead Jr. was the senior senator from Alabama, and I think he was on the Appropriations Committee of the Senate. So their sister goes up gets an appointment with Harry Hopkins to ask for WPA money for building an archives and history building in the state of Alabama. And then she's got her plans, and she takes them up and shows them. And according to the story, Hopkins says, you know, we just can't give federal money for everybody who wants to build a little museum or something like that. And so she says, well, I'm sorry about that. And she says, would you call one of my brothers to come pick me up? And he says, who are your brothers? And she says, well, one's Will and Bankhead and one's John Bankhead. He says, and Hopkins says back to her, Miss Owen, let's talk about this building a little bit more.
And we got the archives.
We got the archives, and it's a glorious building. It's I think it's one of the great public buildings in Alabama.
What year was that building built?
It was started in late 1937, and it was dedicated in 1940.
The guy, was there only one guy between you and Miss Marie?
No, Miss Marie retired at the age of 85 in 1955, and she was succeeded by Peter Brennan, who had already been working there for 45 years. So Mr. Brennan now probably knew more of Alabama history than anybody who's ever lived. He was a remarkable man.
Was he from Montgomery?
No, he was from Russell County. He was from Seal. Yeah. But he had been working at the archives and with Thomas McAdory and before that, and he was incredible. He wrote all these columns in the newspaper, wrote books, and he just had an encyclopedic memory. But Mr. Brennan died in '67, and then Milo Howard. Many people probably remember Milo Howard. Milo succeeded Mr. Brennan in '67, and Milo died in late 1981.
And you were succeeded.
And then I followed Milo. Yeah.
So hadn't been many archives.
No, there were. I mean, the sixth one is Steve Murray, who's director now.
Now you oversaw the expansion of the new building and everything.
Yeah, yeah. The western wing was added.
What all's in that western wing?
Below the ground level is a huge kind of vault area with compact shelving and really high quality environmental systems where we store the most important records from Alabama, the constitutions, the legislative records, the governor's records. And it's a huge, really high quality storage area. You really don't even see it. It's below ground level. And then the first floor has the research room and the auditorium. And the second floor is the new Museum of Alabama. That's where our museum exhibits are. Yeah. And then the third floor is a staff working records processing area is on the top.
Ed, going back to the era I want to talk about, the Bankhead era, come out of that Bankhead era after Will, but do you give any time to, do you mention Tallulah in the book?
No, I didn't.
Didn't mention Tallulah?
There's so many things. It's just painful, the number of
Did you
great
mention the Bankheads at all?
I did, yeah.
What about that congressional group that came during FDR's administration when Alabama had so much power? Did you mention Hugo Black?
Yeah, I do.
Hugo Black's in there. Cotton Tom Heflin's in there.
Yeah, and Bibb Graves.
Bibb Graves.
And Lister Hill, Sparkman. An amazing Henry Stegall from your area.
Yeah, banking.
And of course, both of the Bankheads, and so it was an amazing group of members of the Congress.
And you mentioned Stegall because he was chairman of the banking.
Glass-Steagall Act, one of the monumental finance bills in American history, is sponsored by Henry Stegall from Alabama.
You know, Ed, I'll tell you a funny story. Little Jim told me about Big Jim had to do with Henry Stegall. I'll take about 2 minutes at a time to tell this story.
I think it's in your book, isn't it?
Yeah,
I love it. Tell it. I love it. It's a grand story.
But it's a true story. When I started writing, I asked Little Jim, I said, give me a Big Jim story, and heard. Well, Big Jim was aspiring to be a politician at a young age. And he grew up in Elba in the Wiregrass, and that's that old Henry Stegall 3rd District. And Mr. Henry was chairman of the bank committee, and you know, he'd been there 25 or 30 years, and at that time, he was such a national figure, he'd gotten the big head. He would actually come home to Dale County and hunt pheasants or birds with Brooks Brothers suits on. And so people were saying Mr. Henry had gotten too big for his britches. And so he would come home, wear nice suits and everything, and most guys wore overalls in the Wiregrass. And Mr. Henry would come back, and he picked up about 3 opponents because of that. And they had the big rallies on the square, and Big Jim was the only one in his 20s running, but Henry picked up about 2 other opponents in their 40s and 50s and 60s like he was, and they were making all kind of accusations about Mr. Henry. Mr. Henry Stegall's gotten so highfalutin and he's chairman of that banking committee up there, and them big New York bankers fly filet mignons in from Delmonico's for him to have steaks every night. Fly him in New York to Broadway plays. Have him pheasant on the glass. And Owen said he brings in fine wine from Paris for Mr. Henry to have. Banking committee chairman. Don't come home to the Wiregrass. Goes to New York to plays with fine wine from Paris, steaks from Delmonico's, and the last one got to say he not only drinks fine wine, eats fine steaks, he dates young girls up there in Washington. They got young girls up there for Mr. Henry. That's what he does all day long. Finally got to be Big Jim's time. He said, well, I've been listening to y'all lambast Mr. Henry about sounds like the job of a congressman is drink fine wine and eat good steaks and date young girls. I believe I can do a better job dating those young girls than these guys can. Y'all need to send me to Congress. That's a job of a congressman. Anyway, I didn't mean to get off on
I bet he could have, too.
Yeah, that's right. But you mentioned Big Jim, don't you?
Yeah, I
One
did.
of the best pictures, you picked it up, and I can't find it now. And it showed how big Big Jim was for that era. I mean, he looked like he was like talking to little children.
Like a different species. Like
I know.
of
I'm glad you got that picture.
Yeah.
That picture tells the size, because someone 6'9" in that era was doggone big. And people were smaller. What all did you say about Big Jim in the book? Did you say much about
No,
him?
not really. I mean, it was mostly that he was of the World War II generation coming back. He came back early and ran for public office. It was a whole new generation. And also that, I mean, he was pretty progressive in a lot of his views and just kind of beat his head against the wall, couldn't get many of his bills passed.
At what point did you stop talking about Alabama politicians? You covered up to recently?
2010 elections.
You covered the 2010 election?
Don't you think that 2010 was a watershed in Alabama history?
Yeah, it sure was. When Bentley won the governor's race?
Well, I mean, the Republican Party gets super majorities
and probably will stay
in the
that way.
legislature and all of the constitutional offices. I mean, think that Alabama had been solidly Democratic since 1874. And even though the Republicans were making inroads, the whole thing just flips completely in 2010.
It did, and that's funny. It took a transition over starting in '64 in the Goldwater landslide. The South totally went Republican nationally. Yeah. But our local offices still Democratic.
And the legislature. I mean, you were a Democrat.
Yeah, oh yeah. The whole legislature was Democratic, and then all the judges. But you're right. 2010 would have been the watershed. Some people say 86 because of the backlash of Hunt and Braddock debacle.
Getting a new Republican governor. But if you think about it, the Republican governors didn't have much power.
No,
the Democrats control the legislature, and they really still ran the show until 2010.
You know, Ed, one thing that going back to that 1901 Constitution that we don't think about as Alabamians, you and I do because we're historians, but those black belt planners who wrote that Constitution, they wrote it with the intention of putting the power in the legislature in Montgomery.
Yeah.
And they didn't want a strong governor because they thought someone like Big Jim would come along and be progressive because the North Alabama yeoman farmers would vote for a progressive like a Big Jim Folsom, which they did. But Big Jim couldn't get anything done because the black belt controlled the state legislature.
Yeah.
And even our Constitution was so archaic because of that reason. And we had such a strong governor when I was a young man, a young legislator with George Wallace, that most people assumed the governor office had the power. Yeah. It wasn't that. Wallace had just usurped power.
It was his own political power, personal power,
And people got that misnomer that the governor had this power, but it was totally Wallace. Yeah. And you see that today, where the governor today, going back to Riley and Bentley, had very little power.
Yeah, I mean, you know, when you were in the legislature and there was a Republican governor and the Democrats control the legislature, the governor would send his budgets
throw in the garbage.
Literally, you could see him just throw it in the garbage can. Yeah,
they sure did. And but what's your most fascinating part of mine's political, of course. Do you love the Indian era, going back when they came in the Stone Age, or do you love the whole thing?
Like I said, I love it all. Every place you stick your foot in is interesting. There's just not an uninteresting place.
Do you think that you sort of sometimes say there was an era of politicians that came out of that World War II, but what I saw an era of politicians that before the race issue, I'd say the 20s, the 30s, and 40s, we were a very progressive state. As far as our congressmen were progressive, when the race issue started boiling over in the 60s, for that 40-year period from the 20s to 60s, when the race issue was benign, Jim Crow was in existence, and African Americans couldn't vote, our delegation was made up of erudite, very sophisticated, basic progressive New Dealers.
You know, there's really an interesting story, and I think Mills Thornton has told it really wonderfully in some articles that he's done, but let me kind of give you a short version of that. If you look back to Alabama politics in the 19-teens and 20s, you get this huge division that Bibb Graves was talking about between the big mules and ordinary people. And so Bibb Graves is, you know, he's the guy that comes up with the phrase big mules when he's running for governor in 1926.
He coined that.
He coined that phrase. And so Bibb Graves represents the working man, the common man. And if you look back in it, Bibb Graves was the grand cyclops of the Ku Klux Klan clavering here in Montgomery. Hugo Black was in the Ku Klux Klan in Birmingham, Jefferson County. There's stories that Lister Hill was at least associated with it. These guys of the 1920s were connected with the Klan, but they were connected with ordinary Alabamians, working class Alabamians. That's where their constituency was. And when the 1930s came and they got into office in the New Deal, they were still representing working people, kind of working class, and all the people they had butted heads against, you know, in the 1920s were the big business interests. They gradually take over, and then when Roosevelt comes into power nationally, Roosevelt opens the doors to these guys because they're like him. Roosevelt's trying to appeal to working class Alabamians, and all these guys from Black, Hugo Black, Bibb Graves, Will Bankhead, they all embrace Roosevelt because he's pumping federal money into Alabama to help rebuild a state that has been so impoverished and struggling for so long. And so we have, like you say, we have this congressional delegation, both in the House and the Senate, of some of the leaders of the New Deal, the national leaders of the New Deal, these Alabama guys, and as you say, they continue all the way through the 1950s. And then when race starts breaking out, these guys have been not hard enough on race. And when Alabamians white Alabamians get more fearful after Brown versus Board of Education, this old New Deal group is regarded as too liberal.
It was a culmination of that, plus they were getting up in age.
Yeah, that's right. They were
all aging. were soft on the race issue, but they were really ready to retire
That's
anyway.
right, yeah.
You know, I wrote this last week about that 62 Senate race where Jim Martin basically beat Lister Hill in that Republican race in 62. But going back to that era, you had an entirely different congressional delegation, and they had a lot of power.
They sure did.
See, the power in Congress is gone. You know, Sparkman, I remember guys who would go to Washington with Sparkman and work with him to the twilight of his career. I had a lot of friends who would go up there and work with him. And he would lament to them. He'd take them to lunch and say, you know, the power of Congress is gone. You know, back during that era, Ed, they were in charge of the post office. I mean, every time the post office, a new administration came in, they got named the postmaster of every postmaster of the one and up, or wherever it was. Every post office, you know, that was just totally, everything was political. But that was a different era. You know, I bet you a lot of people, one thing, we ain't got about 3 minutes left and I'll talk about this. You know, one thing that changed too, you and I talk about the Indian stuff. Do you know people who are real long-time Alabamians, there was a lot of intermarrying and among the white settlers and the Indians at that time. I bet you if a lot of Alabamians who are lifetime Alabamians have been here a century or more, if they did an ancestry, like this Ancestry.com thing you see on television, if they put, I don't know how they do that, but the DNA or whatever, they'd find Indian blood in their veins.
Yeah.
And a lot of them would.
One of my favorite stories is, you know, the Indian leader who led the attack and the massacre at Fort Mims was William Weatherford, Red Eagle. And it was the largest, probably the greatest Indian victory in North America of all the Indian wars, where Indians attack a fortified American position. Their victory at Fort Mims was the greatest. And there are a lot of people around here who are descendants of William Weatherford. You know, today they're just ordinary people in society.
For a while, when you and I were young, people didn't want to talk. Now they want to brag about it.
That's right.
You know, they say, well, I don't have any Indian blood in me. You know, but now they all want to claim, well, I'm William Weatherford's great-great-grandson. You know, or great-nephew. Now it's a big thing to say your quote. It's sort of in vogue. You know, to say, but we really are.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Indian blood and a lot of people in Alabama, especially Creeks, because they dominated the entire state.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, and they stayed here after the war. After a lot of them,
a lot of them were expelled and driven out and forced to go to Oklahoma, but there were still pockets where they stayed, and a lot of them had already been intermarriage, and at that time, maybe the children of an Indian and white couple would just present themselves as white.
Right.
And they would kind of hide their Indian ancestry, like what you're talking about.
Because you really couldn't tell there was not that much difference in the, but you could a little bit, the type of hair people would have and that sort of thing. But I bet if a lot of Alabamians did that, whatever they do now, the roots, the
DNA test,
they'd find I've got 10% Indian blood, you know, because it takes generations to change that, you know. Ed, you're just a real legend in Alabama. I appreciate you so much. I appreciate you writing this book. I know it was a labor of love because you enjoy Alabama history, but folks, now are you going to have book signings around the state? Yeah,
there'll be a number of different places, and I was just talking to Randall Williams, a New South book here in Montgomery. He said they will have these books in by the end of this week.
Good.
And
so it's just
they're
out
at the archives. It's really, literally just off
How
the
would
press.
they order it for Christmas gifts if somebody wanted a Christmas gift?
Well, I mean,
Amazon maybe?
Yeah, Amazon's got it, or all of these online book places have it. I always like to encourage people to buy it from the local bookstores, though, because we want to keep our local bookstores in business, too.
Folks, our guest tonight has been Dr. Ed Bridges, the retired head of the archives and history for 30 years in Alabama. He's got a great book out, Alabama, the Making of American State. We thank you viewers for watching. Hope you tune again next week for Alabama Politics. Thanks, Ed.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it.